Canada has had a fake genocide going on for a little while now. Apparently, it was going on from the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, where people were just going to school, Indigenous people were going to school, and ruthlessly and brutally being murdered by their teachers for no reason other than blatant out-and-out racism.
Yeah, they were accusing Catholic schools of doing this, and then suddenly people going around and burning down churches, and lots of the Canadian government were saying, well, we understand the sentiment.
Yes, of course. We're not going to condemn it. Like Jeremy Corbyn, we condemn all violence of all kinds, but nothing in particular, nothing specifically, though. So, and I thought I'd talk about that because it's all bunk. It always has been bunk. Obviously, schools occasionally have bad things happen at them, but it's not like a meat grinder where you just went into these schools, you got processed through, and then just shoved into a mass grave out back. As we'll discuss in a moment, after I tell you all about the premium videos that we have on the website, constantly, all the time coming out, day after day. It never stops.
That's why Harry's so tired.
Yeah, and you should never stop paying for them either, because it's as little as £5 a month. This one in particular is one that we had with the notorious academic Nimi Parbibi on Economics of Empire, a new episode of Brokenomics, Dan's series, which was very good. So you should check that out because, of course, everything that we're living in right now is the sad outcome of empire, including the terrible, terrible case of the missing school children. This was a New York Times article that was amended in January of 2022, but originally came out in June 2021. And this was part of a massive surge in all of these articles, all coming out at the same time going, oh my God, Christians murdered millions of children, billions of children, trillions of children who were indigenous to Canada, all went missing. But that's not what the original title was. It was actually because this, even though the article is basically the exact same, they changed the title to be a little less inflammatory because as more and more information was coming out, they were starting to think, this doesn't look good if we're just out and out lying about the information. So it was originally mass graves, and then it turned into missing children, vanished children, ghost children. Poof.
Something happened.
Into thin air. It was probably those dastardly Catholics. They're known
people
for,
did something.
Mea culpa, mea culpa.
Yes, something happened. And let's go through the original claims that were part of this article, because once again, it doesn't matter if you're going with they were murdered or they vanished into thin air. The actual content of these articles was all the same. And this New York Times one, for what it's worth, is a good summation of everything that was going on at the time regarding the reporting here. So they say the discovery of the remains of hundreds of children at the sites of defunct schools in British Columbia and southern Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan.
It's
Bless
Canadian. Who cares?
You're right. Exactly.
Has rekindled discussion of a sinister time in Canada's history.
Can I just ask? The remains of hundreds of children, as far as I'm aware, they didn't actually find any bodies.
I don't know what you're on about. It's not
Right.
like it was literally ground penetrating radar that found soil disturbances and they immediately jumped and went, children! Dead children!
Right. Okay, so not a single bone, not a bit of teeth. They're all just Jimmy Hoffa, right?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I believe in this.
Obviously, because it's very telling to me that leftists, whenever they see any soil disturbance, they just go, well, obviously hundreds of thousands of people must have been murdered here, because that is generally what the leftists do whenever they go into anywhere. They
Except in the
I think that's just because that's what's going on in their heads.
Yeah.
They're thinking
Okay.
about
Well, what would
murdering a bunch of people.
what would
Wishful
I
thinking.
have
yeah.
done?
Right. Yeah, wishful thinking on their
Yeah, what would I have
That's what
done
we
in
would
this
do.
situation? Obviously, I, as a leftist communist, would have murdered hundreds of thousands of children. So that's the only solution
Right.
to this mystery that we've uncovered here.
That's going on Lotus Eaters out of context.
Yeah. Across Canada, many Indigenous communities are beginning the lengthy process of identifying unmarked graves on the grounds of former residential schools and investigating the deaths of children who attended the schools where generations were abused and sometimes died. There will be a twist to this story, don't worry. In late June, the remains of 751 people, mainly Indigenous children, very, very suspiciously specific numbers that they're using in all of this, were discovered at the site of a former school in the province of Saskatchewan, thank you. A Canadian Indigenous group said the discovery, the largest one to date, came less than a month after the remains of 200 people, mostly children, once again, very, very specific numbers, were found in unmarked graves on the grounds of another former boarding school in British Columbia. In July, can you try and pronounce this one for me?
Peneleku?
Sounds right.
Yeah, Peneleku tribe in British Columbia. Thank you for being my translator for this. Said it had uncovered about 160 undocumented and unmarked graves.
Now, this reminds me of the '90s satanic panic where they said that there were daycares committing ritualistic child abuse, and there were loads of women that went to prison for it despite not having actually killed them.
It is suspiciously similar in that. Now, I have seen some more recent things that show that, or where I've heard people say maybe there was something to that. Maybe there actually was. It looked like there
Satanic
wasn't.
panic.
In terms of the schools having like underground passageways and things like that.
Oh, okay.
I don't know
Okay,
if that's true or not.
that's concerning.
Well, I don't know, but I've heard conflicting things about that. It did seem to be at the time that was more or less completely bunk. But I mean, that was the satanic panic at the time. It was commonplace to think that, well, it was common pop culture stuff at the time to think that there were all these satanic cults going on. And you're right, it does sound very similar to that, that it's right underneath everyone's noses. There's this horrible thing that happened. And it's only now being discovered because now we're more enlightened, of course, in our progressive march through history.
Yes. I do like the satanic panic looking back on it because one of the main like claim that I remember, well, not remember, but I'm aware of because I wasn't alive during it, was the whole Judas Priest putting backwards messaging in their songs to get their audience to kill themselves. When Judas Priest came out and said, "Why would we want the people who pay for our music to all kill themselves en masse? This would be a very bad marketing technique." Also, the fact that, what was his name, Rob Halford, their singer, when he came out of his drug addiction and went to rehab and came out and gave his first interview, and they said, "How did you get through it?" Said, "Well, if it weren't for God and Jesus, I never would have come through the other side."
Never listened to Judas Priest, might start.
They're a really good band. They're really great. So this was all part of the indigenous school system that went on in the 20th century, earlier 20th century, I think maybe late 19th century as well, in Canada, where these schools were part of a system that took indigenous children from their families over a period of about 113 years and forced them to live in boarding schools where they were prohibited from speaking their languages. Now, obviously, this sounds terrible, but what this is literally, what this literally could be described as is assimilation. And I'm finding it very unfortunate that leftists are going against assimilation because the latter half of the 20th century in America in particular has just been one case of forced assimilation after another, which always turns out badly. But the Catholic schools doing it probably would have had a slightly lighter touch than the US Army forces would.
Yeah, and they also probably wouldn't have based it, as we went through in Comics Corner, off of the work of someone who was a big fan of Alfred Kinsey.
Yeah, that's always suspicious when the same names start cropping up, don't they? An estimated 150,000 Indigenous children passed through the schools between their opening around 1883 and their closing in 1996. Since taking office in 2015, Prime Minister Blackface Justin Trudeau has prioritized putting in place a list of 94 actions for commemorating the students and improving the lives of Indigenous people. Some say he was this close to donning all sorts of traditional Indigenous outfits and whipping himself publicly.
Oh, I'm sure he had them all picked out and everything.
Oh, yes. But Indigenous leaders believe that the government still has a long way to go because, of course, when you give these people an inch, they will always take a mile, unless you are literally handing them the keys to the government and handing them millions and millions and billions of dollars, the sort that would make Dr. Evil blush, then you're not really doing enough, are you?
Again, I just like to raise the point. And any actual bones by this point? You know, we're reorienting.
That's a racist question.
Oh, I forget. I also read the Aboriginal Rights Bill. And
we're going on Australian Aboriginal rights logic, which is if you ask the question, you're racist.
Yeah, I've upset the rainbow snake, and therefore I must pay reparations.
There you go. The water's going to dry up, Connor. You've ruined agriculture for everyone now. So it was about 20 years ago, an effort was made to find remains started at the Kamloops School, which is one of the big places where all of these claims are coming from, which operated from 1890 till the late 70s and was once Canada's largest with 500 students at its peak. Members of the Kamloops, in the Indigenous words, First Nation, made their grim discovery after bringing in ground-penetrating radar, and that's where all of this contention comes from. Initially, and this is literally a lie now, they reported finding 250 remains, but about a month later, and after further analysis of the scans, they lowered it to about 200, so I'm glad we're being scientific about this. Among the bodies found by the radar, sorry, like when you know any of the details, as we'll get into, the fact that they're being so specific about finding bodies and finding specific numbers of bodies as well is kind of hilarious. There appears to be one of a child who died as young as 3. These are all lies. These are all complete lies. And listen,
the specificity of the ground penetrating radar, how would you know the approximate age of a child? That would seem just on prima facie, the premise seems flawed.
But what they're doing is they're relying on anybody reading this will have no understanding and no experience in the kind of technology that's being used to make these claims. So they'll assume by ground penetrating radar that what you're getting is some incredibly detailed 3-dimensional model of what the ground looks like underneath, and they're seeing bones, and they're able to use these models to estimate the size of them, and through that estimate the age of the people.
It's
involved.
Hollywoodified. Of course, that's not what it's like. It's
like people.
very
It's like the people who
black and
assume
white
that the FBI is using technology where it's literally like those ones where they go zoom in, enhance, zoom in, enhance, and they're taking an image and making it more and more detailed with every zoom.
Yeah, they think they've discovered the X-rays of essentially the children and headdresses from Peter Pan. That's what they're imagining.
Exactly that. But what does this all come down to in the end? Well, on August 10th in 2021, the government announced an additional 320 million Canadian dollars for Indigenous communities, and then announced that they would be creating an overseas Indigenous relations, creating an advisory committee, including experts on archaeology, forensics, and mental health. So money for friends, positions in government created for friends, so that you can continue to corral money to
nice
all these
grift.
people. Always happens. That's what it always ends up doing, is just giving people more and more money. Lauren Southern was really good from the start on contesting these claims and actually looking into what was going on, because you had absolute brainlets, like lowest of the low IQ morons like Lance from the Surfs, immediately showing up, having no understanding of the technology that's been using, or the real claims being made by the researchers who conducted the research in the first place, immediately showing up to say, here's how Canada needs to pay reparations. Here's how we need to talk about
Redistribution.
Yeah, redistribution and retributive justice. All of these communist talking points. And Lauren Southern was immediately there to start debating on these things and produce documentaries, and also talk about how, nobodies had been found in any of these graves, if any of them had been excavated in the first place.
Well, the reason they're jumping on this is both the sort of post-colonial narratives that have become very popular, and also the
we
way
need to talk about decolonization.
Yeah, and the way in which retributive justice often plays out, and you see this with Ibrahim X. Kendi's recommendations, you see this with Extinction Rebellion and their climate focus groups they'd like to appoint, and now with the Aboriginal bill and with this, they're essentially creating a unelected dictatorship of the proletariat style committee that will oversee all government policy from an intersectional lens. So it's just a useful instrument for leftism. It's just another avenue for the practical application of the policies they would like to see come to fruition.
Yeah, soft managerialism. We need to create more and more bureaucratic departments with which we can fill with people who otherwise in society would fulfill no useful practical role, so that we can funnel money to them.
Yes.
Ultimately, it's also just vindictive. And there's research that I've read on this and I've made videos about on it, where you find that people who are in favor of redistribution of wealth to make up for past mistakes or whatever, however you want to describe it, it's very highly associated with envy, jealousy, and rage. The people are not being driven out of altruism. They're being driven out of wanting what you have, what other people have. It is completely selfish. And in fact, some of the studies that I read on this found that these people would rather have $1 or £1 rather than have £5, as long as other people didn't get £5. They would rather have less, as long as other people also had less. It is absolutely vindictive. It is about spite and jealousy and hatred. It is not about redistributing.
Similarly, I've seen recently for an article that I did for the website, which you should read if you're watching this. It's called On the Difficulty of Right-Wing Organization. I was talking about the difference between temperament within right and left. And some people get annoyed when you use those kinds of terms. They're more shorthand for people with particular worldviews that can be grouped together, because they obviously exist. And you can see how they exist, because even in scientific studies like the ones that you're talking about, there was a heat map done that I referred to, where it showed people's preferences, whether they identified as liberal or conservative, to whether you preferred to loyalty towards those of your in-group, your family, your friends, those close to you, and those of your out-group, that being foreigners, minorities, and such. And consistently, conservatives always cared more about the people they know, their own personal circle, and liberals, if you want to call them that, leftists, or whatever your preferred term is, always preferred those outside of their close circle. So these people, like you say, are actively vindictive and actively hate those who should be closest to them.
Actually, in that particular study, the loci of concern for leftists was actually so far out that they were more concerned with rocks in space than they were with people who were of an out group compared to them. or their own families.
They
were
also
more
tended to prefer animals to humans.
yes, animals, plants, asteroids, more important than their own families. So, which I know sounds ludicrous, but
And Reddit suddenly makes so much more
Right,
sense.
right,
There's the
yeah.
total inversion of that as well,
Mhm.
where there's the virtuous victimhood paper that was published a little while ago, where there's a Venn diagram overlap that's nearly a circle between the people that categorize themselves and the group that they believe is the best avenue to personal enrichment as victims, and also dark triad traits. So
Yeah.
they have the personality types that allow them to seize upon political issues and crises, put themselves at the center of it in order to accrue social capital and resources.
Yeah, I've read the virtuous victimhood paper as well. So,
Yep.
yep, exactly.
Yeah, but going back to the specifics of what we're talking about here. So, in this documentary, which is very good, I would recommend people to watch it. Lauren Sutton described how, at the time, let me just see when this one came out. This was still in late 2021, almost 2 years ago now. 64 Canadian churches had been burned down in the areas where these Indigenous people were. So, this has obviously created a lot of resentment in those communities where they did just decide to go over and burn down these churches. In this particular debate, Lance from the Serfs decided that he was going to try and blame it on incense
Yeah.
in these 60.
Sorry?
Just coincidentally, 64 churches happened to burn down after this news, all because of pure incense being lit by irresponsible
Right.
pastors and monks, priests, etc.
If most of these were Catholic, per Vatican II, most of them don't use incense anymore, much to my chagrin, because that's actually a nice part of it. So
Why does
No.
why does facts and evidence have to come into this? The left is the side of science, and science doesn't need facts and evidence.
yes, I
God
forget
damn it.
this scientist who said that you can have abortion up until the point of birth, but you can't take meth because that would be intentionally killing the baby.
Perfectly consistent. I don't know what you're talking about. But another thing that was talking about here is, as we've already mentioned, the ground penetrating radar. They actually show in here what it looks like. Let's see if I can find it. It was somewhere around here. Oh, I should have. Yeah. I think it's around here. So I don't want to show the thing. Damn it. Oh well. It basically is not particularly robust in showing you what it
No.
actually looks like. What it looks like is some very, very blurry footage where you can see lines displayed on the screen, and if it's showing ground disturbance, the lines will squiggle around a little bit. But that's about it. Certainly not like 3D renderings of graves filled with bones, filled to the brim, like the killing fields of Cambodia or something like that. No, that's not at all what's going on with this footage. And then also they talk about how Saskatchewan,
Yes.
did I get it right? Hey, I did it
Third
right.
time's a charm.
Was actually just a normal graveyard where sometime from the 1960s to the 1970s, the gravestones had been taken down due to falling out of repair. And that's all it was. So they'd rediscovered a graveyard that everybody already knew was a graveyard, and actually included members of the entire community, not just the Indigenous Canadians. We're also talking about the white descendants of European families as well.
A graveyard next to a church?
I know. Unheard of. Unheard of. But then if we go to what's going on these days, people are just seeing more and more that this whole thing was complete bunk, and it just doesn't justify any of the measures that were taken afterwards. Now, tell me if that reminds you of any other major incidents that happened in 2020 to 2021, where a massive social cause was engendered by the mass media, and then you had people going out and causing damage to other people's property, and it turned out to all be based on lies and nonsense. Does it remind you of anything?
It reminds me of two specific instances, actually.
Okay,
At the
go
same
on.
time, yeah. Both lockdowns, and then the thing that you're allowed to violate lockdown for, which was St. Floyd.
Right.
Yes. I think I remember the old the old guidelines literally made a specific exemption for unless protesting.
Oh, I think it was the Lancet that declared racism a public health emergency, therefore it was allowed to go ahead.
Well, if the Lancet said it, it must be true. So this article talks about some of the other measures that were taken outside of just people going and burning down churches completely by accident with incense. They mention after 2 years of uproar, none of these graves that have been found have so far been excavated. In June, it was reported these graves were found. The Times recounted that the remains were of mainly children. Orange Shirt Day, an offshoot of Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, with the added tagline, Every Child Matters.
Except though we like to abort.
Yes, was implemented in schools across the country Flags were lowered to half-mast at public schools, universities, and federal buildings to honor the 215 children found in an unmarked mass grave at the former Kamloops residential school. Once again,
Were they,
never
though?
found. That year, calls to cancel Canada Day went viral, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, always on the money with this stuff, ready to come out with some emotional speech, said that the day should be one of reflection rather than fireworks. I can hear the way he would intone that in my head as well, suggesting the country think of those for whom it's not yet a day of celebration. In Winnipeg, protesters, as you would imagine, toppled statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II, chanting "No pride in genocide." Churches were vandalized and burned to the ground, mostly on Indigenous land. A wooden church named St. Anne's near Headley, British Columbia, where members of the Upper Similkameen Indian Band had been gathering for more than a century, was razed, as with the Sacred Heart Mission Church, which has served the Penticton Indian Band since 1911. So these were actually churches mainly serving the people who were supposedly victimized in the first place. Burned to the ground. As always, this is all just an excuse to attack Western culture. It would have been a horrifying story, as they say, if it were true, but no remains have actually been discovered. No graves were discovered. There had been no excavation. Rather, ground-penetrating radar anomalies had been detected, which, for all we know, could have identified 2,000 feet of trenches in a long-forgotten septic field installed in 1924, as one researcher suspects. And that's one of the researchers who conducted the experiments. All of this for what might have been trenches for septic fields.
So both the story and the evidence is literally a load of...
Yes.
Right.
And they just want to repeat again and again, to date, no excavations at any of these sites had turned up human remains, except one of them. One of them has been excavated. There was last month an excavation at the Pine Creek Residential School in Manitoba determined that 14 anomalies suspected to have been children's graves were actually literally nothing.
Oh, that's inconvenient for the narrative.
Literally nothing. To date, of the hundreds of suspected graves identified starting in 2021, Pine Creek is the only one that has been followed up with an archaeological disc.
And it probably will be the only one, considering it
yes.
looks really, really bad now.
Millions of dollars, an entire committee, churches burned to the ground, everybody forced to reconcile and think about how terrible they were for the supposed guilt of their own ancestors doing terrible things. Complete bunk the whole way through. In operation for more than 80 years, the school was already well known for having disproportionate rates of student deaths who were buried on site. Using church and government records, in 2015, a report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had already been conducted regarding all deaths regarding these churches, these schools, and they were only able to name around 50 children to have died at the school. The 215 were believed to be undocumented deaths, according to a statement by Kamloops chief Roseanne Casimir.
Right, so they consulted the tea leaves and determined this number from...
Yeah, what time span was this?
What time span?
In terms of when did they think these people died?
That's a racist question.
Yeah, that's
Right.
probably a very racist question.
And of what? Was it a disease, or were they intentionally killed?
Yeah.
That's, of course,
And
the
of
question.
these, having looked into it, the report itself determined that in every single case, it wasn't really neglect, it was disease.
Mhm.
And every single one of these kids had been rushed to medical facilities and tried to be treated, because people forget, especially in the first half of the 20th century, that we still had a lot of deaths just from disease. It was still very easy for you to just catch something and you're dead. Sorry
Polio
to
wiped
break it
out
to you.
hundreds of kids.
Yes. And when the Cowesses First Nation in Saskatchewan announced a survey showing 751 unmarked graves near the site, as I mentioned, Chief Cadmus Delam was careful about saying that they were not a mass grave. Rather, these were plots within a larger Catholic cemetery whose headstones Delorme had said had been removed by the Catholic authorities in some time in the 60s and 70s. This is not a mass grave site. These are just unmarked graves. And big, big fuss over nothing, loads of damage done over nothing, millions of dollars over nothing. That's not to say that abuse and neglect didn't happen in these schools. Obviously, you have to contend that there was. But if you're going to try and make reconciliation for the crimes of the past, you shouldn't have to make up those crimes, for God's sake.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium contents on the site, such as the Contemplation series, this episode on cults, episode 4. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.